All right, well, I think we'll get started. Welcome everyone to this exciting event. I'm delighted to host this conversation today about the outstanding new book, Bridging the Theory-Practice Divide in International Relations. I'm Jordan Tama. I'm an associate professor at American University, and I'm a co-director of Bridging the Gap. And the mission of Bridging the Gap is to promote policy-relevant scholarship, the dissemination of research to audiences beyond academia, and direct interchange between scholars and practitioners who work on international issues. And put another way, our mission is exactly what this book is looking at, to foster the types of research and engagement that are the analytical focus of this groundbreaking new book. That's what we do at Bridging the Gap, but this book is tackling these issues analytically. And just to say a word about it, the book is edited by Daniel Maliniak, Sue Peterson, Ryan Powers, and Mike Tierney, published by Georgetown University Press. And it really provides the most comprehensive and analytically grounded assessment to date of efforts to connect research and practice in international studies. And without taking too much time, because I want to get to the other panelists, I just want to highlight a couple of really important contributions of the book. First, it looks across many different areas of international relations, including human rights, the environment, foreign aid, trade, international finance, conflict, nuclear strategy. And this wide aperture allows the editors to develop conclusions that apply across the entire field of international relations, and to think about how differences in the nature of issues affect bridging efforts. And secondly, the book features paired chapters by scholars and practitioners evaluating bridging in the same issue area. And these conversations are themselves terrific examples of valuable interchange between scholars and practitioners across the divide. And we're really fortunate today to have on hand two of the book's editors, three other contributors to the book, and a terrific discussant. I'll just introduce them briefly. Mike Tierney is George and Mary Hilton Professor of Government and co-director of the Global Research Institute at William and Mary. Ryan Powers is Assistant Professor of International Affairs in the School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Georgia. And Mike and Ryan also co-lead the Teaching, Research, and International Policy Project, commonly known as the TRIP Project, and the book draws heavily on the TRIP Project's great survey data. Amanda Murdie is Thomas P. and M. Jean Louth Public Affairs Professor of International Affairs and head of the Department of International Affairs at the University of Georgia. She's also Editor-in-Chief of International Studies Review. Ambassador Sarah Mendelson is Professor of Public Policy and head of Heinz College at Carnegie Mellon. She's served at senior levels in government as U.S. representative to the UN's Economic and Social Council and as a Deputy Assistant Administrator at the U.S. Agency for International Development. Joe Young is professor with a joint appointment in the School of International Service and School of Public Affairs at American University. He's also an editor of the blog Political Violence at a Glance. And Jim Goldgeier is professor and former dean of the School of International Service at American University, and Robert Bosch, senior visiting fellow at the Brookings Institution. He co-directs Bridging the Gap with me. And Amanda, Sarah, and Joe have all written chapters in the book, and Jim's going to serve as a discussant. I'll start by first asking each of the panelists questions, and then we'll turn it over to the audience for questions and answers. Please submit any questions that you have via the chat or via the Q&A function. I'm going to start with Mike. So Mike, you and your co-editors distinguish in the book among three different ways in which scholarship might connect to practice: relevance, engagement, and influence. Can you just talk a bit about what the difference is between these concepts and why it's important to distinguish between them?
We'll do so, but first I want to thank you all for having us here. Bridging the Gap is obviously the title of our book is a close cousin, and I feel like we move in similar realms. And thank specifically Jordan for corralling all of us here today, and the Carnegie Corporation of New York that helped to sort of fund the research that led to the book. So really appreciate you hosting us today. Oh, in terms of common vocabulary, so one of the first things we noticed when we were looking at the literature on the gap in international relations was there was a lot of folks talking past each other. This is not a sort of well-developed, mature area of study where we've all agreed on what the terms mean. And so just in order to have a conversation, we needed common language for the 27 people that were in this particular book project. We hope that this, generalizes and people adopt this language, but, for us, it was helpful. And so the first one is relevance. What does it mean to do policy relevant research? And we ended up taking a rather broad definition. We said research is relevant when academic ideas or empirical findings that are potentially useful to policymakers. And this, we really sort of defined it so broadly to distinguish it from a much narrower definition that we had found in the literature that I thought we were in part to blame for, because we had one particular way of measuring relevance, which was whether or not you have policy prescriptions in your academic article. And a number of people had seized on that and said, look, policy prescriptions are the sine qua non of relevance. And so we explain in the book why we think that is overly narrow. It's one way to go, but it's overly narrow. So we sort of defined it against what sort of Mike Desch had said was the centerpiece of relevance, or even Kronig and Byman suggesting that this was the way to what you needed to focus on. And so how do you know it when you see it? In the book, we kind of cheat and say it varies by context. And the experts in these different issue areas are going to talk to us about in their context, what is relevant, what was meaningful to practitioners. So what work was done in the academy that ends up being useful. So it's somewhat inductively derived. The second one, influence, is the one that people spent the most time on in the book. So when it got right down to it and people were trying to make claims, whether they were using anecdotes or systematic qualitative evidence or the trip data, what they were really trying to do usually was explain how academic research or researchers influenced policy in their area, right? We told them to do something broader, but that's what they did, right? They wanted to do influence. And so most of the empirical work in the book is about influence. And here what we learned was, so we know conceptually what that is. We have a better idea what it is conceptually. Ideas or empirical findings that have an effect on practitioners and or the policies that they craft. So that's straightforward intellectually, but trying to connect the dots from an individual or an idea to influence was much more difficult. And so, but really it was just empirically difficult. It wasn't conceptually difficult. And then third and finally, right, and so you can think about what those things are in terms of influence, like direct consultation, where Bob talked to Joe and Joe made a decision, or at the other end of the spectrum, Jordan Tama educating master's students at American University who become policy practitioners, and lots in between that we talked about. The last one, engagement, was actually the easiest to study empirically. It's just, we could think of many things that we could measure that were sort of indicators, more direct indicators of engagement. And this is less about relationships, and it's more about what did individual academics do. So here, are they being hired to serve in government, right? Is Joe Nye serving in the Clinton administration? It's whether or not you're an in and outer, you're going back and forth, or whether you're consulting and moonlighting. It's are you writing for policy outlets? Are you giving briefings to Congress? Are you doing contracted work for USAID, et cetera? So here's where we had a much clearer sense of what engagement was, and many argued in the book, engagement was probably a necessary condition, or if not necessary, it's like highly correlated with influence. If you're not trying to engage, it's less likely that you'll be influential, or maybe even policy relevant. So anyway, that was a long-winded answer.
Oh, that's great. And Ryan, one of the other things you do in the book is develop what you call a demand side theory of influence, arguing that the influence of scholars on policy depends in part on the nature of the issues that they're addressing. Can you explain that idea and maybe give a couple examples to illustrate how the nature of issues can vary and affect the ability of scholars to influence policy?
Sure. Thanks, Jordan. Again, yeah, and thanks for hosting us. This is a great opportunity to share this project with a broader audience, especially in the context of a pandemic where book talks are scarce. But yeah, you're right. The demand side theory we have argues that the probability that an argument or a scholar is going to be relevant, or the level of relevance or engagement that a scholar might enjoy, is going to depend on the structure of the problem or issue area they're working in. And I'll put some more detail on that in a moment, but I want to put it in the context of other arguments about the divide that others have made. And in particular, the two we sort of focus on in the book is how a lot of past work is focused on professional incentives in the academy that lead many scholars to engage with, or lead many scholars not to engage with policymakers, but instead to focus on publishing in top peer-reviewed journals, securing grants for basic rather than applied research, or even focusing on contributions to sort of intra-disciplinary debates that have little import for day-to-day policy questions. So that's one set of arguments that a lot of past work is focused on, and we think is super important and helps understand, at least on some level, why IR scholarship hasn't been as engaged or as influential as it otherwise might be over the last 50 years. The other sort of set of arguments that we engage with are a version of a demand side story focused on the time and attention that policymakers have to pay attention to developments in scholarship. So practitioners are busy people, they're problem solvers, they're trying to make decisions on a day-to-day basis, and they can't keep track of the status of some working paper and whether it came out in the APSR and whether they should pay attention to it. So there's a time and attention effect or constraint that leads to lower demand for expertise from scholars relative to, say, practitioners at think tanks or some other source for sort of informed input into the policy process. So those are what we viewed as sort of the existing dominant arguments for why the gap exists. But one of the things we notice is that while professional incentives for academics and the time and attention of practitioners, it's largely fixed across issue areas, but you see variation in the level of engagement and influence that IR scholars enjoy across those issue areas. So for example, in foreign aid, you have IR scholars who are sort of working directly with aid bureaucrats and practitioners to design projects, help them evaluate performance and develop new policy. And in contrast, say in trade policy, where I do some work, you just don't see IR scholars in the trenches at say a trade summit with the USTR trying to help them get a better deal at the negotiating table, or helping the International Trade Commission to implement temporary trade barriers in some more efficient or more effective ways. So we got interested in trying to explain that. Given fixed professional incentives and given fixed time and attention among bureaucrats, why do you get this variation in engagement across issue areas? And we sort of came up with this argument based on the epistemic communities literature that it's the structure of the policy problems at stake, right? So we think there's two big variables that affect the ability of IR scholars to influence policy practitioners and affect demand by policy practitioners for input from IR scholars. And those are basically uncertainty and access. And on the uncertainty sort of axis, what we think about is how new the problem is, how much established or incumbent policymakers know about it, how much do their staffs know about it, how much do the normal constituencies from which they get input know about the problem. And when those groups don't know much about the problem, there's increased opportunity for IR scholars to have some say. So that's uncertainty, and we can talk about examples in the Q&A if you'd like. But I did want to also focus on the other variable that we mentioned, which is access. And we think of access varying in at least two ways. So IR scholars, in order to be directly relevant or have a direct impact on policy, they need access to policymakers, or at least access to those with input into the policy process. And so we think there's a few things that vary across issue areas that determine or establish the ability of IR scholars to have that access. And that's one, the level at which decisions are made and the frequency with which they're revised. So in some issue areas like nuclear strategy, policy decisions are taken at the very highest levels and not revised all that often. Whereas in other issue areas like, again, foreign aid, policy decisions and the sort of structure of aid projects, et cetera, are delegated to relatively low levels. And that provides many opportunities, sort of many shots on goal for IR scholars to have input into the process. And then the final piece that I think is important to think about is whether other scholars got there first or other experts got there first. So in some issue areas, the policy practitioners have sort of established relationships with outside experts who they can turn to when new policy problems arise, especially in trade policy, for example. They're not going to come knock on the door of IR scholars and IPE scholars necessarily. They're going to go to trade economists. And so if there's sort of an incumbent community of experts that are not IR scholars in a given community, the probability that IR scholarship is going to have something to say in terms of influence into the policy process directly is relatively low. And then the one final point I wanted to make that sort of came out of our discussion with our policy practitioner contributors is that we should probably treat practitioners and policymakers as strategic actors. So our argument sort of treats IR scholars and practitioners as victims of almost circumstance or the structure of the issue area. But IR scholars and policy practitioners are agents themselves, and they have preferences. They might be normative, they might be bureaucratic, related to bureaucratic politics, they might be ideologically motivated, and they're going to go on the hunt for evidence that supports their particular sort of policy predispositions potentially. And sometimes that leads them to select on think tankers or NGO communities or constituents who are going to be affected by the policy, but other times it's going to lead them to IR scholars who have research that happens to sort of comport with their pre-existing worldview. So that's the last piece of this demand side argument that we don't develop as much in the book, but we'd like to, as we move forward with this kind of work, think about and integrate into our sort of theory of policy relevance.
That's great. And next I want to dig into a particular issue area, human rights. And we have two people here on the panel, Amanda and Sarah, who are both human rights experts and wrote about human rights in a paired set of chapters. Amanda as a scholar, Sarah as a person who's been a senior practitioner as well as a scholar, and want to ask each of you a couple questions. So Amanda, first, in your chapter, you talk about the ways in which human rights scholarship has had impact on practice. Can you speak a bit about that? Tell us where you think human rights scholarship has had impact, and then also talk a bit about how the cross-disciplinary character of human rights scholarship has been important. You highlight that in the chapter, that you think as a cross-disciplinary field, this has been helpful to human rights scholarship in terms of influencing policy. It'd be great to have you talk a bit about that.
Yeah, sure. Thanks very much, Jordan, and thanks to the whole Bridging the Gap group here for having us. And then, thanks to Mike and Dan and Ryan and Sue for this great volume. I think this calls for, this time that we're in calls for all of us to be talking to each other and not talking past each other. So I really appreciate this opportunity. I'll answer both your questions. So what impact has human rights scholarships had beyond academia? Well, the first thing is we as IR scholars, we don't have the biggest impact in relation to other fields. So if you look at who is being cited in the UN Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights, it's legal scholars. And so the Human Rights Quarterly, which is a cross-disciplinary journal, gets cited a lot, but it's very rarely citations for political scientists. It's a lot more citations for legal scholars. So all of the examples that I'll show, and I think we have a lot of examples of really great work that's being used in the policy community. All of those examples are just one small bit in this larger realm of how academics are actually influencing human rights policy. So I give a whole kind of litany of examples in the book chapter. I talk about the scholarship on advocacy networks and how that scholarship has actually made it into text of Declaration of Rights. I talk about research on treaties and whether they're effective and how that has actually influenced how the UN thinks about treaties and about how to improve the treaty system. Talk about sanctions and how research by Durson Pexon and Reed Wood and others have made it into, how we think about the negative effects of sanctions, even sanctions for human rights purposes. I talk about the political instability task force, and I think that kind of relates to what Joe's probably going to talk about related to civil war as well. But we have this repression protest nexus, and human rights scholarship is at the key there, and that has definitely been a big policy concern. I talk about forecasting data, and then again, repression kind of adds a big part of what we think about when we think about collecting events data related to protest and repression, and related to how we forecast where events are going to happen. David Singranelli, actually a big human rights scholar, had a huge project that focused on that. I talk about the literature on transnational justice and how that literature was actually kind of co-involved with some NGOs. And then I talk about more broadly kind of what we know about human rights scholarship that has actually been co-authored with people from NGOs and has been supported. So organizations like the Ford Foundation, the International Council for Voluntary Agencies, the American Jewish World Service have all been really supportive and co-authored with human rights scholars, or supported human rights research and used that research in their own work. And then finally, I talk about data. And I think our data sets that we're producing as IR scholars have had this huge effect on the policy community. I interviewed David Richards, who was part of the CIRI data set, human rights data set. And David had 500 examples of organizations in 150 countries that have made use of the CIRI data set. Another way that our data is being used is actually in international tribunals. And so that's not country year data, that's data by people like Patrick Ball that's at a very small, minute, very precise level that's actually making it into international tribunals and court cases. So all of this, I think, talks about a great future for how we think about human rights as IR scholars and our impact in academia. One example right now that I think is really exciting is this work that's actually kind of co-evolving. So actually involving academics in the creation of data and the creation of data that will be useful for the human rights practitioner community. And the Human Rights Measurement Initiative, which is at University of Connecticut and University of Georgia, has actually been really helpful in getting the input of Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International and other organizations in how we create our data. So I think the future is bright, and I think there's lots of examples of, or at least anecdotes of the ways in which human rights scholarship has entered the policy community. For your second question, your question about why we have this impact, I think it has a lot to do with how human rights scholars are trained. A lot of us take cross-disciplinary classes. We have to talk to those that don't have our same mindset, don't have our same lingo. We have to review things that don't have our same lingo, but have maybe a common lexicon for human rights, but different lingo when it comes to talking about measurement or theory and things like that. So I definitely think the cross-disciplinary nature of human rights work has really influenced kind of the way in which we talk to each other and the way in which our research is actually accessible to a larger community. And then I also think, really when you look at the TRIP data, human rights scholars do have some activism in our blood. And I think that makes us maybe a little bit more open to working with the policy community and maybe venturing outside kind of the ivory tower in which we work. So I hope that answers your questions. I look forward to more questions later.
Oh, that's great. And Sarah, I want to turn to you. In your chapter, you offer a bit of a cautionary note, suggesting that IR scholars are not really addressing the contemporary issues that are of most concern to human rights practitioners today. I'd like you to talk a bit about that. What issues on the agenda of human rights practitioners are not being addressed by scholars, and what should scholars be doing to address those concerns of today's human rights practitioners?
So thank you. And I really want to thank the organizers of the meeting that we had in 2015, which was really just great. And thank the patient editors themselves for putting this together. As you noted, I've worn both hats, and I know that it is difficult sometimes to build that bridge, but it is really, really important. I want to say a word first actually about philanthropy, because some of us, Jim definitely, myself included, were the subjects of experiments that philanthropy, a group of philanthropists engaged in long ago, far away, before the internet, which was about field building. There was the Carnegie Corporation, Rockefeller, Ford, MacArthur engaged in an effort to diversify the field of international relations. It was a decade-plus effort that emerged after the publication of something called the Mac-Bundy Report, urging a widening of the field beyond just great power struggle, and also beyond just what was going on in the Kremlin, as the Soviet Union was then a big focus. I've written about it briefly for the Stanford Social Innovation Review, but I think it's relevant for this conversation. And I want to applaud the Carnegie Corporation for funding this work, because they're one of the only ones that continues to focus on the field building and the importance of this. So I want to note that the research for this chapter was done about 6 years ago, right now. But I would say, alas, that a lot of it is still extremely relevant. And I come to you literally 25 minutes ago from the global annual forum of the Public International Law Network, where I was with a group of human rights practitioners, lawyers. And I would say there is a sense of real crisis in many parts of the human rights community. Yes, there are, Human Rights Watch continues to do the kind of reporting and issuing of publications that they have always done, but walk around the world and you see a real concern over relevance and influence, or what we might call the relevance and influence gap. And they are looking for new and different approaches to address this issue. So how do we reframe human rights in a way that makes sense to the lives of everyday people in their everyday lives? And that puts much more of a focus on socioeconomic issues, on corruption. I would say this was true before the pandemic, but it is absolutely crystal clear after the pandemic. There's also a kind of refresh in terms of thinking about inequities and inequality in ways that I think the human rights community was reluctant to do. The issues that I note in the chapter, closing space around civil society, atrocity prevention, mass atrocities in many localities, trafficking in persons, Russian aggression, historical memory, all of those still relevant. And I think it's parts of the human rights community looking at the SDGs. I will tell you that I've come also from an exercise that I helped run with the Rockefeller Foundation and the Brookings Institution that is, it's called the 17 Rooms. It's an expert conversation on each of the SDGs, and I was a moderator for room 16. And this is a room with experts, human rights experts, practitioners, academics from around the world, really focused on new and different priorities. And one of them, I think particularly may be interesting for this group, creating a community of practice that uses the SDGs to teach and train a new generation of human rights practitioners that are listening and responding differently. And here, putting the role of public opinion data as really front and center, so that you're able to listen and respond much more to the populations that are meant to be served. And that really addresses this influence and relevance gap.
Thank you, that's great. And next I want to turn to Joe. And Joe, your chapter is written with Mike Finley, and the two of you look at the area of intrastate conflict. And you discuss some major efforts, policy-oriented efforts to tap academic expertise, efforts linked to policy institutions. Can you talk a bit about some of those efforts in the conflict area, and what lessons do you draw from them?
Thanks, Jordan, for the question. And I want to thank Mike and Sue and everybody who put this together. It was, as Sarah was saying, it was a really fun conference that we went to years ago. And as you just mentioned too, that I need to thank Mike Finley, who was my co-author on this, that, and obviously the Bridging the Gap program as well for holding this. So I think what we can take from these efforts that have happened, and we're saying intrastate conflict, but we could use civil war or other sort of domestic conflict kind of ways, is that sometimes academics can have pretty big direct impacts. And that's short of just advising key decision makers, which is what I think old school way of thinking about this is we just assumed that the Kissingers of the world had the impact where everyone else was falling short of that. But for, using the IQ's data and models to inform policy, that can be a pretty big impact. And sometimes that influence can also be just much more humble, but at least academics are being consulted and are part of the conversation, a larger conversation. And IQ's, for example, has provided data for all the combatant commands, some of the intelligence community, State Department, the NSC, and under Obama, they were used to provide scenarios for both how the Arab Spring would unfold and helped inform our response to that. They used that data to predict coups in Paraguay 6 months out, as well as the crisis in Turkey. So we had a sense for what was going to happen in Turkey. And it also was helpful in predicting election violence in Kenya. So there have been some notable successes of using that and informing policy. It's a little less clear when we're talking about the Political Instability Task Force because it's a little more under the radar. Most of what they do is, secret, but I know it's been used in similar scenario assessments, and they actually more regularly recruit academics to come and speak to them and to talk about particular issue areas and talk to them about particular substantive points, and which some of our colleagues have been involved in. So I kind of similar to Amanda, I'm sort of positive about how academics are being involved in these processes with the kind of important caveat that some of that interaction has been shut down recently under the current administration. For example, the Minerva program, which is a big funder of research in this area, has been shut down. And those decisions seem to be mainly political and not about sort of best practices and what we've experienced in the past.
Great, and I want to turn next to Jim. And Jim, would love to have you talk about what is the most important contributions of this book and where you see opportunities for more work to advance bridging, either on the research side or other kinds of efforts to advance bridging.
Great. Well, thanks, Jordan, and thanks to everybody for doing this. Thanks to the editors for putting this together and the chapter authors. I mean, this book is a great contribution, and it's so unusual because of the way in which it pairs the scholars and practitioners, and also because of the way it covers so many issue areas. A lot of the work that we have been focused on bridging the gap for so many years has really been national security studies and the way in which this broadens things out, which is part of the broader TRIP effort. And I just really can't say enough good things about TRIP and what Mike and Ryan and their colleagues have done to build such a wonderful program at William and Mary. I think, some of the things that are important. One is, as Joe was just talking, I mean, his chapter with Mike Finley, remind us that policy relevance is not just where you take an academic article and you add a couple paragraphs at the end geared toward the policy community. And I was thinking in preparation for this about the fact that in recent years, we've lost several titans who worked for so many years behind the scenes, educating policymakers in both the executive and legislative branches on nuclear issues. John Steinbrunner, Jan Nolan, Bruce Blair. I mean, these were giants who demonstrated that the quiet application of expertise behind the scenes over long periods of time is a primary way of shaping policy. Hard to measure, often not even known, but so impactful. And those are three people who we really miss in terms of their ability to bridge the gap. Always important to remember that the key value of academics is the expertise they bring, and that's both knowledge and, as Sarah describes in her chapter, methods. And that's true whether we're talking about teaching, going on TV, or talking to policymakers. It's not punditry. This is about expertise. And I really loved the exchange in this book between Amanda and Sarah. In fact, when people ask me about the book, that's one of the first things that I point them to, because you have, as you heard from Amanda, She describes the ways in which human rights research has had broad-based impact, whether informing human rights organizations and foundations or finding its way into UN reports or creating measurements of abuses. I mean, she details this very well. And then you have Sarah come back and say, well, I really want academics to help me answer the questions that I had to deal with as a practitioner. And in her case, first and foremost, the shrinking of space around civil society. And she has some great suggestions on how social scientists can help get at the problem. And, and I just think that, having somebody like Amanda with, such deep scholarly expertise, and in this case, Sarah, not just as a practitioner, but also with academic expertise, I think, it really helps. That interchange is just really terrific. And in that regard, I just want to mention a new program that we have at Bridging the Gap, as Jordan knows well. It's called New Voices in National Security, and it's funded by the Raymond Frankel Foundation. We started it in 2019 and just been renewed for another couple of years. And what we've been doing there is we take a topic, for example, economic sanctions, and we build a workshop around it. And what we do, similar to what Sarah was suggesting, is we ask policymakers in advance what questions they would most like the answers to. What things are they working on that they would like academics to answer? And then we reach out to 6 scholars from outside of DC to write short memos in response. We bring the communities together to discuss. And partly this is because we know that even if work is being done on the issues that practitioners care about, how do they know where to find it, especially if the work's being done by emerging scholars outside of DC. And, Ryan referenced this. I mean, for us, it's the reason why after so many years of focusing on the supply side of training people to be able to engage the policy community, we've turned our attention to the demand side and thinking about how to help policymakers find the information that they're seeking. I really liked, I don't know Mike Finley well, but I know Joe Young pretty well, and the chapter definitely fits Joe's personality, because I think a major takeaway is just the need for humility, that we really need to recognize that the kind of thing we're talking about, it's hard. We shouldn't overstate the importance of the ability to get academic work in front of people. We have a Bridging the Gap book series with Oxford University Press, and as their article suggests, we don't want books that are really primarily academic books with just a couple paragraphs at the end about policy relevance. We want the policy question and the effort to use scholarship baked in throughout. And as Mike and Joe point out in their chapter, academic work might be valuable, but the findings are often probabilistic rather than determinative, and that makes them harder to use for someone who has to make a decision. And often, of course, the findings are behind a paywall, which make them really hard to use. But I remember how, a few years ago, we had a senior U.S. government official speaking to our faculty workshop, our International Policy Summer Institute, and people were asking this person about impact, and he said, well, let's just give you an example. I mean, if you have this work on civil wars and you tell me that, in 70% of your cases, this is how civil wars end. Well, that's great. But like right now, I only care about one case, and that's Syria. So unless you can tell me what I need to do in Syria or what your theory leads me to expect about how this is going to end, it's not going to be important for me. It's not going to be important for me at this moment. And I would just close by just saying that, it's just great to see how these two communities, the scholarly and practitioner community, can be brought together in a fruitful exchange. And I really would encourage PhD students who are trying to think about what kind of topics they might want to pursue for their first big project, their dissertation. This book is a really rich resource, and students, working in these 8 different issue areas can really dig in and think about, what kinds of questions are important questions to ask that they might build their dissertations around.
Great, thanks, Jim. And I see we're starting to get some questions in the Q&A in the chat. That's great. Please send in additional questions and we'll try to get to them soon. Before we turn it over to some of the audience for questions, I want to ask one more question, which I'm going to pitch first to Ryan, but it's really open for anyone to chime in on. One of the controversial aspects of this issue for those of us who have been giving a lot of thought to bridging the gap type questions is the role of research methods in contributing to gaps between scholars and practitioners. And some feel that, a huge part of the problem is that scholars use research methods that are not accessible to people who don't have academic training, especially advanced quantitative methods. The book, though, does not find evidence for this. You conclude from the book that there's no evidence from the issue areas that are looked at in the book that quantitative methods are really responsible for gaps between scholars and practitioners. Ryan, can you just speak a bit about that? And then I'd love to have others chime in just on this general question of what role methods play, if any, in gaps between scholars and practitioners, and what are the takeaways that scholars should have when thinking about, is my research going to inherently be, policy irrelevant or inaccessible to scholars if I'm using certain kinds of research methods? What should scholars be thinking in terms of methods?
Sure, yeah, thanks. I think the answer to this is going to depend on which of the contributors you ask. In general, across issue areas, we found fairly little evidence that the quantitative turn or the turn towards statistical methods in international relations made us sort of less accessible or less relevant. Mike Desch and Paul Havey in their chapter on nuclear strategy and nuclear security do find some evidence that as IR scholars adopted methods that looked more like economists using formal theory and some quantitative models, that they did, that policymakers did find their work less directly relevant or useful. But others in the volume just disagree. Like if methods are the problem, like a number of our contributors pointed out that economists wouldn't have the sway that they do in virtually every issue area of domestic and international policy in the United States today. So they've turned, heavy towards formal theory, heavily towards sophisticated identification strategies, and they came out the other side having more influence over policy than they did before. So I think, at least in my view, the role of research methods is maybe uncorrelated with relevance, impact, engagement. You might imagine there being a greater role for research methods in terms of engagement. That is, policymakers might be more comfortable engaging with less sort of quantitative methods or methods that were less formalized. But in terms of the actual relevance and impact at the end of the day, I think a lot of some of the supply side stuff related to communicating the findings from research may be more important. And I think the other piece of this is that, as I sort of briefly mentioned at the outset, that policy practitioners are strategic actors, and they're going to care less about how you reach your conclusions, and potentially more about the conclusions that you reached. And in that sense, you see some very sophisticated methods like those that Amanda and Joe mentioned with respect to IQs and the Political Instability Task Force having enormous influence, and that seems like a success story. But then when there are other methods or other works based on less sophisticated methods that also hold sway, sometimes to our chagrin, thinking about the continued invocation of clash of civilizations by policymakers in the United States, right? So in that sense, it suggests something about selection effects by policymakers or strategic selection, and less about the actual underlying methods. And I think this is where the Bridging the Gap project has been enormously useful, in the sense that regardless of the method, whether it's very sophisticated and careful and nuanced qualitative work, or very sophisticated and nuanced and careful quantitative work, you can write the op-ed, or you can write a blog post, or you can be hooked up with the Bridging the Gap network and communicate the upshot for policymakers and practitioners. So that's my view. I'm sure there's going to be variation, because this was kind of in terms of where contributors might have disagreed or generated most discussion in the book, I'd say this hypothesis was probably where there was the most disagreement. So I'll let the others jump in now.
And Joe, I think you want to jump in on this.
Yeah, I do. Although what I wanted to say was almost exactly what Ryan said. So, and that I just think the methods are sort of orthogonal to this outcome, and more importantly, kind of the whole point of bridging the gap is developing a common language and a way to converse with each other. And sometimes academics are from Mars and policymakers are from Venus, and that's kind of the challenge. And it doesn't, so I would encourage PhD students who do any kind of research, whatever it is, that you can still engage in this, but what you have to consider is how do you converse with this other side that doesn't use your jargon, doesn't use your shortcuts, and sort of understand how they communicate so that you can have this meaningful interaction, regardless of the tools or methods you're using to draw inferences.
Anyone else want to jump in on this?
Sure. I'm actually calling for more quantitative approaches. I'm in a sausage making exercise at the moment where with colleagues, we're thinking about what a new US strategy to promote democracy and human rights would be and how to combat authoritarianism. And part of the problem that we're identifying, and we're trying to take it out of a Trump versus Biden conversation, but look at where we are, what are the problems? And part of the problem that we have is, I'm going to use supply side and demand side in a different way. We have a lot of supply side coming from appropriators in Congress giving money to state and aid, and then implementers implementing. What happens, the population that you're meant to benefit is too often left behind. If we had a situation where in the democracy and human rights space, we were much more like health, where we had RCTs as a just gold standard practice, I argue we'd be doing better work. So having people trained who can do large random sample surveys of a population, using that data to derive the programming should be what's going on. And I tried my little bit at USAID to divert funds to do that, and with some success maybe. And the center still exists, but we need a lot more of that. We'd have a body of work that says this is what works and this is what doesn't.
Okay, so I want to turn now to some of the questions that are coming in, and I'm going to group a couple questions. So Carl Jason asks, how can the theory practice divide be bridged in non-Western contexts? What are some of the challenges that you see there? And Haley Swedland asks, from a European perspective, I'm based in Europe, and Ryan's comments got me thinking about differences in access across different foreign policy communities. I can think of scholars, for example, who have participated in international trade missions, both in Europe and in Africa. Is this variation discussed in the book at all? So both questions, talking about different kinds of policy contexts, in particular outside the United States, Europe, non-Western world. Anyone want to offer some thoughts on that?
Can go very briefly and get out of the way. One of the things that we noticed on the TRIP project before we even started working on this book, so this is 8 to 10 years ago, is so this book was not intended to focus on US foreign policy, but it weighed heavily in that direction. I mean, there's a mix, especially in the environment and human rights chapters and the Civil War chapter, there is a lot about other policy practitioners that are not in the US government, but inevitably, based on the people we recruited and based on the data that we had, a lot of it was really focused on US foreign policy. So one of the things we say in the conclusion is, we need to do this type of work somewhere else. And the last two things I'll say is, number one of the things I quickly recognized was the United States is a strange place to be studying the theory practice divide and the bridging function. So there's about, depending on how you count, there's between 4,000 and 5,000 international relations scholars in the United States, right? But any government is sort of set up the same, no matter where you are in the world. It's sort of set up roughly similar in these functional ministries. and there's a finite number of people in the ministry that want to talk to an expert on human rights like Amanda Murdie or an expert on terrorism like Joe Young. Turns out most countries aren't like that. You know, most countries have between 15 and 150 international relations scholars. So one of the things we found really quickly once we started doing these surveys cross-nationally was that scholars in other countries, their services are much more in demand by their government because there aren't any of them. There's just so few. So that's thing one. The second thing I'll say, and then I'll be quiet, is in another part of my life where I wear a hat, I'm involved in the Aid Data project here at William & Mary. We spent a lot of time making a lot of mistakes trying to help either local nonprofits, local NGOs, or to help provincial governments or to help national governments in developing countries with our new data and our new methods. And we struggled and failed repeatedly to get uptake of our data and methods, which was our goal, because they could make better decisions if they had our data and methods. And so one of the lessons that took us too long to learn was that you need really good partners within universities in the global South. If you want to do this well and you want to engage with governments or practitioners on the ground in developing countries, you need to have people who know what they're doing in those country contexts. Shocking conclusion, but something we probably should have learned a long time ago.
Two brief comments on that one, if we have a chance. The first one, I think, to reflect on what Mike said, I think one of the big issues here is that we need time and space, and we need time and space in unique ways. So this goes back to the IR literature. The IR literature says you're going to get norm diffusion, you're going to get, you know, true engagement when you have time and an insulated space for people to talk. And unfortunately for policymakers, especially if you're going across countries and across global North and global South, you don't always have that time to discuss these issues. But a couple of things that I've been at, there's been some really good discussions when you have that time. So there was a group of the International Consortium for Closing Civil Society Space, and they brought people together. We were in a closed room talking across global North and global South for a few days, and I think that was pretty successful. The second point I would make, just to reflect on what Mike said, is that we know that NGOs and the NGO world operates differently in different contexts. And just to reflect what Mike said about governments and calling on academics differently, work by Sarah Stroop would say that not all NGOs will call on academics, and some will call on them in different ways. So I think those things really need to be understood as we think about taking this great book and looking at how things relate in the rest of the world.
Can I say one thing, Jordan?
Absolutely, yeah.
This consortium, Amanda, I'm happy that you had a good experience. This came out of something I wrote at CSIS just after doing the book chapter for this book, and raised the money for the consortium and then peeled off to USUN. And I was concerned actually that it didn't succeed, that it didn't have any real impact. And we're still so struggling with this issue of closing space. I mean, I feel like I'm pretty good at identifying the problem, but then coming up with a solution that is still not getting to the problem. So, you know, if it makes sense, then such a consortium should continue. I don't know that the donors felt that it should continue because we couldn't see what the response was.
Yeah, I think this might have to do with time horizons. It takes a long time for academic work to be published. I know of lots of academic work that came out of that, and it's still in the review process. So this goes back to this really, you know, crucial divide about, we're talking about timelines that are 5-6 years in length to get things published, and policymakers are talking about things that you need answers to questions quickly. So I definitely understand that divide. Thanks.
Go ahead, Jim.
Yeah, just on this issue of sort of the US compared to other places, I would just say two things that I think are worth noting. One is just the way in which we think about community of scholars and community of practitioners. I mean, in the US, it's fairly unusual that you have so many scholars who also at times become practitioners. and then go back to being scholars. I mean, that there are a lot of countries where that work by a scholar in, the world of practice and then coming back, I mean, it just doesn't happen to the same extent. And I think, it's I mean, look at all the academic work that Sarah had done before going into government, and how much, and now bringing back her experience as a practitioner back as she does her work outside of government. And the other thing I would note is just, although this is changing, and it's interesting, it'll be interesting to see how this continues to change. I mean, historically, the United States has had many more think tanks than countries elsewhere. And so you have this whole group of folks, at these think tanks who are often trained as scholars, who are trying to produce work that would be of value to policymakers. And in fact, it's one of the reasons why we started New Voices. I've been concerned for a long time that people in the policy community keep going to in DC anyway, keep going to a narrow group of people, because, they can go to the think tanks, they know the people are going to give them a product that they, the product is geared towards them. They don't have to do a lot of work finding people who are, outside of DC. And again, as Joe had pointed out in his chapter, doing work that's behind a paywall. And so, there is some concern that practitioners in DC are relying too heavily on the think tanks and aren't aware enough of work that's done outside, especially by emerging scholars. But I just raised this because, we are seeing in other countries now a rapid growth of think tanks. And I think that will also have an impact in these other places when we're thinking about the interaction between scholars and practitioners.
So we've got a question that's come in about direct advocacy by scholars, a question from Maggie Manson. She asked, you mentioned the ease of accessibility for human rights scholars to the policy realm because of the advocacy role they often take. Do you believe that the increased volume of advocates in academia has a compromising role for the objectivity of IR research, or a positive effect in terms of bridging the gap? Amanda, maybe you'd like to take a stab at that first, since you had mentioned the advocacy character of some human rights scholars.
Yeah, I actually wrote a blog post on this at Deca Minerva. I don't think you need a neutral human rights scholar. Like, I don't think you need someone who's neutral on cancer to be your oncologist, right? You can be anti-cancer and be a cancer researcher. And I think you can be, pro-human rights and be a human rights researcher. And I think it all depends on our honesty, our humility, like Joe Young was talking about, and our ability to use our methods that we know and use them well.
Can I raise a policy issue that we need help on that maybe this group could help, which is if there's accessibility between academics and, say, the bureau at state DRL, there's a much larger problem of within state DRL being marginalized. That the regional versus thematic is a real struggle. And there's lots of weird competition between DRL and other parts of, well, USAID and the NED. There's a lot of dysfunction in this community. We're not rowing in the same direction. But the real issue, and you see it also in the human trafficking JTIP, the regional bureaus do not want to deal with these issues. And so there's a constant tension.
I was just going to follow up real quick on Amanda's point. I think what's kind of neat about the allowing for advocates in the context of sort of more credible research designs, more pre-registration, and thinking through causal inference and working towards more reproducible research, you get to potentially have your cake and eat it too. You get to have advocates who ask important questions, ask the questions that they think will be useful to humanity, and we can validate their research against their prior expectations or whatever what have you. That in earlier eras, you might have worried a little bit more when more research was sort of black boxed, for lack of a better term.
Great. And a question also came in about scholar practitioners, like Sarah, notably. Kurt Klingenberger asks, is there a notable difference between policymakers who are also scholars, perhaps an Ash Carter, and those who are not when it comes to requesting or accepting academic world inputs? Sarah, why don't you take a first stab at that? Jim, I'd love to get your thoughts on that as well.
I'll say Ash was my husband's boss at one point. My husband is also in the book. I think if I can speak to the Department of Defense, Department of Energy, physicists who go into the policymaking world, there's obviously a big interest in openness, particularly to Stanford, Harvard. These practitioners have lived in those contexts, right? So they have the relationships and they're open to input. I think a lot of this has to do with culture in different agencies. And so in the opening conversation, the difference again between an AID and state in part has to do with culture. AID has lots of PhDs, is used to having PhDs come and help them. There's a lot of openness. I think there's much less at state. There's a lot at DoD in different pockets, partly also because it's extremely technocratic still. You have to have a lot of expertise. Some at DOE, and also you've got labs where you've got people with PhDs rotating from the labs to these agencies. I don't have a lot of experience with the Intel community. We all know that Bob Jervis has engaged with them a lot. My sense is there is openness in that community to academics. So yes, I think it does make some difference. I think Ash was probably on the one spectrum, sort of particularly open, but it does make a difference.
I just add, so just following up, just especially the last point about the intelligence community, I think that, the synergies that get created because it's the community that's most like the academic community in terms of doing analysis. And for a lot of academics, when we do our training workshops, we encourage folks many of whom are very uncomfortable with prescriptions. And concerned that the nuance is going to be taken out of their work. I mean, we point them in the direction of the National Intelligence Council, for example, because, you have people there who are trying to do analysis just as you would as an academic. And I would also, just anecdotally from my own experience, I was at State in the NSC in the mid-90s. My expertise was much more highly valued at the NSC than it was at the State Department. And in fact, drove me kind of crazy, I will say. Especially, I have so many friends who are career Foreign Service officers. I worked with a number at NSC as well as at State. But I was a little taken aback when I started the State Department. I was 5 years after my PhD, so I had I'd been working on these issues for about a decade, and sort of being in a regional bureau dominated by Foreign Service officers, with people saying, well, I just came back from years in Moscow at the embassy. And I was like, well, okay, well, I've been studying these issues for 10 years. And so, yes, your experience at the embassy was very valuable, but that doesn't mean you know everything about these issues. And, if we should have humility on our end, I would suggest that the practitioners should have humility on their end as well. But I definitely saw a difference. And it's interesting, Sarah mentions the Pentagon, because I always found that in my meetings at the Pentagon, I also felt like there was much more of an appreciation for the expertise than there was at State.
So anyone watching, feel free to send in additional questions either through the chat or the Q&A. I'm going to ask a question really open to all of you, but was triggered by part of the discussion in Joe's chapter. Joe, you talk about how difficult it is to assess the impact of scholarship on policy. Mike and Ryan, you guys also talk about this in your chapters in the book. What are any ideas for how we can kind of move forward that effort to evaluate the impact of scholarship on policy, given how complex that is and how indirect it often is? Are there types of research or ways of thinking that you think would be most useful in terms of getting a firmer grasp of the extent to which scholarship is influencing policy and practice going forward? If you were going to say, start a new research project aimed at trying to evaluate that directly, what might be a way to try to evaluate that effectively?
I can go really quickly. These will not be new and creative to Mike and Ryan. For 5 years now, we've been working mostly on trying to get at this question because of this book. So during the process of writing the book, you assemble 27 really smart people in the room, and a good portion of the time is spent by them telling you how dumb your data collection strategy was and how the measures that you have to measure this concept of relevance or influence or whatever are not fit for purpose. And they were right. And so I may be misquoting you, Amanda, but tell me if I have this right. I think it was you that gave us a variation on the Rumsfeld quote. So Rumsfeld, I think at some point said, you go to war with the army you have, not the one you wish you had. So after Ryan and I and Sue and Dan had been beat up all day, where people were saying, why isn't your data better? Why don't you measure these other things? Amanda said, you write the book with the data you have, not the data you wished you had. But it did inspire us. I mean, we made a long list of things that we wished we had and that we should have. So two things that sort of emerged from this book project that are now in the pipeline. One is like direct behavioral measures of things that people wanted to see that would be better than I have a policy prescription in my APSR conclusion. And the second was the mechanisms, like what are the channels of influence? If we know we can't see them directly, think back to Jim's example of these scholars who spent lots of time and energy, giving private briefings or at cocktail parties or a variety of different mechanisms that we're never going to pick up through text analysis. We're never going to pick up through survey research, et cetera. And so for us, anyway, the short list is you need to do text analysis of policy journals, because Joe Young will write one thing in APSR, but he will write something different in foreign affairs, and it will be based on the same research. So if you're looking for prescriptions or you're looking for advice, you're looking for translations, you're looking in the wrong place if you're looking at the top 12 peer-reviewed journals. So text analysis of policy journals, text analysis of think tank reports, text analysis of books, because we're not just a journal discipline, we're books, and then surveys of other people. It's great that you surveyed all these scholars, but what about policymakers, journalists, think tankers, and then NGO advocacy organizations? Those things that I just described are things that TRIP has been working on for the last 4 years and are working on right now. They don't solve the problem. It's just a bunch of other indirect but slightly better measures of engagement or potentially influence.
Yeah, just to follow up with Mike, I think the only other thing I would offer is to think about who the audience is you want to influence. Like a good portion of IPE is all about explanations why for rent seeking and identifying rent seeking and the conditions under which rent seeking occurs. And it turns out that the people doing the rent seeking are not going to want to implement your policy suggestions to prevent them from rent seeking. And so you have to look at other actors, whether it could be NGOs, it could be think tanks, but it could also be the public. But we also, as we know from learning about vaccine communication and science communication, communicating research ideas and evidence and findings to the public is potentially fraught. The pandemic has sort of illustrated this. So we also need better research on how IR scholars can communicate with the public. Is it an ad in the New York Times? Is it op-eds? Is it community engagement? Is it literally doing surveys of IR scholars and posting it on foreignpolicy.com? Like, what's the best way to inform the public and voters, and are those the actual actors we need to inform for any given issue area to make sort of the findings of IR scholars and social scientists more generally relevant, useful, sort of make the world a better place. So that's the last piece of this that I think Mike left out, but I think it's an important one going forward in terms of how we measure the influence of IR scholars and social science more generally.
Joe, I think you want to jump in as well.
Yeah, I mean, I love those suggestions. I think they're good. I'll borrow something that my co-author Mike Finley would say here. I'm putting on my Mike Finley hat, which is what we really need here are some RCTs, sort of what Sarah was saying earlier, some randomized controlled trials. We randomly assign people to get Bridging the Gap training, and then we have a control group that looks very similar to that treatment group, and then we follow them for some longitudinal period and see what impacts they have. I mean, that's one treatment, right? We could take the Bridging the Gap treatment, but we could treat them in all different ways. And that could really tell us that whether these are having the impact we think they are.
Actually, one thing you could do is, I know Jim wanted to come in, sorry.
No, that's okay. Go ahead.
One thing you could do is you could go back and look at those of us who were subject to the experiment by Ford, MacArthur, Carnegie Corp, and Rockefeller, and see where they went. I mean, it turned out my predecessor at USUN, who was actually the person who negotiated the SDGs, was with us at CSAC. Was also subject to, she was an experiment for MacArthur SSRC. So, there's been some success, and maybe that would convince some donors to get back into that game. I don't know, maybe
yeah, Carnegie should call us.
I do think that, I mean, I'll put my Joe Young hat on and just remind us of the humility. I mean, at a certain level, we just have to, I think we just have to accept that we can't measure this very well, and that's okay. I mean, I think for people who want to do this type of work and feel like it's for them, they care about the issues, they want to engage, and they're looking for lots of different ways to do it, then they should do that work. The challenge really comes from the desire that, for example, tenure and promotion committees would have something that they could measure so that they could, because, people are saying, well, we should be able to reward this type of work when we're evaluating for people for tenure and promotion. And of course, the easy response is, well, evaluating the scholarly work, we have metrics for that. We have journal impact factors, and we have number of citations, and how are we going to have metrics for this? And our colleague Bruce Mendelsohn has gone through this great exercise at Duke. He was asked to co-chair a committee on tenure and promotion standards, and they looked across all sorts of fields and disciplines at the university and did a lot of work outside to put together a really great report on sort of how to build this in. But it's very hard. We should be, one of the things, the thing I liked the most about the Mike Desch book, Cult of the Irrelevant, was not the title, but not the discussion of sort of where the field has been recently, because I think it has evolved considerably since he had started the research for the book. But the history that he goes through is really interesting and really important. And, when you sort of read the section on Tom Schelling and Tom Schelling's, prescriptions feeding into the strategic bombing campaigns in Vietnam, it didn't work out the way that Tom Schelling had suggested they would. Again, speaking about the need for humility, you realize, hey, let's be careful about wishing for lots of academic influence in policy, because it's not always positive. And then the last thing I would just say is, I mean, a lot of it you just won't know about, but that's okay. You don't know the kind of influence. Jordan and I had a meeting at the NSC about 1.5 years ago, and the person that we met with there was mentioning how much he values the monkey cage, because he said, you know, I know that I can go to a monkey cage article and it's going to tell me the 3 things I need to know about X, right? Those pieces are not prescriptive. They're not making an argument. They're not telling decision makers what to do, but they are distilling, you know, this is going on in Venezuela. Here are the 3 things you need to know. And, you know, we were both really fascinated hearing him talk about the kinds of things that were coming in from the outside. And I think, you know, it's hard to measure, and that's okay.
Can I say that if there is a change in administration, you're going to go from a situation where there was pretty much no interest in anybody's ideas to a situation where there's going to be, I think, enormous appetite and a lot of problems. So buckle up. Maybe, knock on wood. Nonpartisan space here, but still.
Definitely seems like there should be a lot of opportunity there soon. And Joe, your idea of an RCT of IR scholars made me think of the British documentary 7 Up, where kids at age 7 were followed for their entire life and to see how they evolved over the course of their lives. And I'm imagining first year IR PhD students, you know, starting to get tracked and then see how their trajectories diverge based on their bridging training and activities. It came up earlier, Mike, you mentioned that in these conversations tend to be very focused on US government, Washington policymaking. A couple of the questions reflected that both within the US and internationally, there are a lot of policy actors outside of government, NGOs being one important set of actors outside of government. And certainly in some of these issue areas, NGOs are tremendously important, human rights being one of them, environment, global health being other areas where NGOs are very important. Amanda or Sarah, would you just speak for a bit about how you might see opportunities for bridging differently in terms of scholars connecting with NGOs versus connecting with government agencies or other kinds of more formal policymaking structures? Is that kind of a, you know, utilized avenue of bridging from the standpoint of scholars, that scholars tend to think about, you know, government, but actually NGOs are out there and, you know, could be connected with in different ways, but those relationships just aren't being, you know, formed and taken advantage of. Would either of you like to comment on that?
I bet we both would, huh?
Yeah.
I mean, I think there's a healthy relationship between a lot of scholars, universities, and NGOs. I think the real issue is, where are those NGOs? I mean, you know, it's easy to have a relationship with DC, New York-based NGOs, but the degree to which you're actually engaging with NGOs around the world. I spent a lot of time in Russia working with an organization called Memorial. And it took a long time. I mean, the relationship building, trust, all that kind of stuff was important. I will tell you that there are a growing number of organizations that you might not think of as human rights NGOs, but they're at this very cool cutting edge space of working on anti-corruption issues or working on access to justice issues. So the World Justice Project, the president, Betsy Anderson, was just saying, I guess now 2 hours ago, to a big forum looking for partnership, and has a lot of data. They do a lot of survey work. The Open Government Partnership, which is a voluntary multi-stakeholder entity that involves civil society and governments, it'll be 10 years old next September. It does really amazing work. I think the one piece that they haven't had enough of is engagement with scholars. So it's, I think, a very healthy space and place to go to. Just know that in a lot of countries, these NGOs are under huge pressure.
Yeah, I would echo that. I would say that with NGOs, you can just cold email your papers and say, like, look, I wrote something that might be of interest, here it is. And I think you'll get a response much more frequently than you would if you were to do that for, State Department or the Department of Defense. So cold emails, I've had pretty good success, and also co-authorship. I mean, there's a lot of NGOs now that have PhDs that are research heavy and are interested in continuing to publish in social science journals. So I think it's a great space.
Great. So before we close, just want to give any of the panelists a chance to make a final comment. If there's something that we didn't cover that you think it might be worth mentioning, or you had any further thoughts on any of the questions that came up. Anyone have any closing thoughts?
Can I just would ask Mike Tierney just to say something about the survey they did of policymakers across different issue areas, because I remember that you had very interesting data comparing folks working on trade issues compared to security. So maybe you could say something about that, because I thought that was quite interesting.
Yeah, that was inspired first by Mike Desch and Paul Avey, who had done an earlier survey of policymakers in the US national security space. And they'd done it at a fairly high level of current and former people who were working at high levels in US government. Anyway, at the book workshops, they got yelled at, and then we got yelled at for not surveying more policymakers. There's lots of stories that people told that were very plausible, which was, hey, Mike, no kidding. The Undersecretary of State is not reading that article, and he never will. But he has a really smart 35-year-old who does read and digest it and puts it in a memo for him. So policy is being shaped by the ideas in that article, but the Undersecretary doesn't even know it. And you just surveyed the Undersecretary. So anyway, we got to work on this with Mike and Paul. And what we did was we went across issue areas. So we did trade, national security, and development. But then we also tried to go down further into the bureaucracy to get to the 35-year-old, which, by the way, we never did. That would have been too large. But we went down, I think, one level in the bureaucracy. And I don't know, I'll give you my favorite thing that we learned. And it was sort of very similar to the conversation, the way we started this conversation today, is that most of what we think we know about bridging the gap comes from studying US foreign policy and national security affairs. And I think Mike and Paul did a great first survey, and it really sort of reflected a lot of what we already thought we knew, right? They didn't want quantitative methods. They valued history, they valued area studies. I thought it was really great, but turns out, I don't know if this is shocking to anyone, but when you look at the gaps, maybe you'll be surprised at the size of the differences. It turns out people who work for the US government, who work at USAID and the State Department, and who work at USTR, they have very different views about what is valuable to them from the academic community. They have very different ways in which they interact with the academic community. They have very different ways that they judge the value of IR scholars relative to lawyers, economists, whatever. They have different views on what they want entry-level people trained to do. So like if I was an APSIA dean, for example, I would really want to see the results of this survey, because it tells you what very different people, different parts of the policy world want as an educated master's student. So anyway, it was fascinating, brilliant. I thought Mike and Paul were really great in helping us to do this together. The bad news is that article, which is brilliant, it was just rejected yesterday. So you're gonna have to write for the working paper, or we're happy to send you the working paper, but you will not see it published anytime soon in a gated peer-reviewed journal.
I'm sorry, that's terrible. It's so interesting to me.
Well, that tells you something, doesn't it? Can I make two final points really briefly?
Please.
There's a really interesting, maybe, intellectual history to be written. There was a convening, and maybe Jim's New Voices is riffing off of this, called New Faces. There was a convening that happened at Bellagio from roughly 1978 to 1992 of young people, IR scholars from around the world, 20 under 30. And when you look at who was invited to this, on the American side, you're literally saying it's all the emerging generation of IR scholars, but also senior US foreign policy folks. So conceivably the next Secretary of Defense, certainly former deputy secretaries of defense, lots of ambassadors. It's a really interesting group. And then finally, it's probably outside the remit, but if there could be something that would change the culture of universities that don't seem to value public service. I mean, we all know stories of former ambassadors and secretaries that go back to their home institution and nobody's interested. I'm very fortunate Carnegie Mellon is not at all like that, but a lot of places are. And it's problematic. I think it is a real barrier for people wanting to serve.
Anyone else have any closing thoughts before I wrap up? No? Okay, well, thanks so much to all of you for a really rich discussion today. This, I thought, reflected really well some of the themes of the book, but at the same time, it only scratches the surface of some of what's covered in the book, because there are a lot of other issue areas covered that we weren't able to get into. And so, go out and get a copy of the book and take a look at some of the chapters on other issue areas as well. I think this is clearly going to be a kind of fundamental reference point for all future discussions of bridging the gap between scholarship and policy, and any future research certainly is going to have to build on this. And so I look forward to seeing how future work on these questions evolves. Again, thank you to the panelists. Thanks to those of you who are watching, and especially those who sent in questions. And look out for future Bridging the Gap events. We're doing a series of virtual events, and follow us so you can see what other events might be coming up soon. Bye, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Jordan.
Thanks, Jordan. Thanks so much.
Thanks,
Jim.
y'all.
Thank you so much.